Ja.
Sehr gut.
E non è difficile da
Bene, bene, bene.
So, welcome back. Very we're continuing our daily broad presentation. The speaker is about the Pohl. We are going to easy to do about the Pohl. So, I cover all the sciences. The Pohl is associated broadly with the learning science of the further implementation. His work is largely in the framework of network transmission around the world, has touched upon several of the non-Roman or allegedly non-Roman groups that were wandering along and across the boundaries of the Roman Empire. In what way where you are enslaved I suppose early Middle Ages were about
Or the other way around.
The paper this afternoon is called Race, Ethnicity, and the Barbarians in the
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Permettetemi alcune parole in italiano prima di iniziare la lezione in inglese. In parentesi, un cambio di cultura accademica notevole. Dunque, questa è la terza relazione in inglese che tengo in Italia in 2 anni. Non succedeva mai prima che un tale invito sarebbe arrivato. Si tratta di un ricordo piemontese. Dunque, nell'anno 2007, al Festival Storia di Saluzzo, mi hanno invitato a fare il discorso, la lezione magistrale su razze, etnie e nazioni. Io pensavo, ma perché mi fanno cavalcare quel cavallo morto? Razza. Perché razza? Perché la mia generazione, maybe I'll switch to English to explain that. I mean, my generation still operated very much under the shadow, especially in German-speaking countries, under the shadow of National Socialism, the Holocaust, etc. So we were positive about avoiding race as a concept, simply to liberate ourselves from the specters of the past. That was mainly my generation. There were wonderful pioneers in the generation of my academic teachers, like my own, David Wolfram, who also had that agenda, but I think it emerged very well from Mirko Cannavaro's presentation this morning, how these pioneers encountered after the World War II, encountered encountered a lot of adversity. It was in my generation that this became mainstream, and perhaps too much mainstream, so we still left an elephant in the room, which was somehow connected to that concept of race that we were trying to avoid. So let me pass to my paper, and I'll start with human diversity. So human diversity has always posed a challenge to societies, and it still does. This applies to interactions within as well as among communities, and most of all to mobility between them. History teaches that there were very diverse ways to react to diversity. This could be a simple us and them divide, or a meticulous differentiation between different types of us. It could be integration or exclusion, keen interest or prejudice, despisal or admiration, intense communication and exchanges or boundary maintenance, aggression or submission. persecution or privilege. Typically, actual relations did not fall into these neat binaries, but moved along the entire spectrum between them. And often enough, there were shifting aggregates of several of these poles. Okay. Does it move like this? Oops. Just to remind you, and it was actually here in Torino that one of the pioneers of archaeogenetics, Luca Cavalli-Sforza, really on the basis of his genetic evidence denied existence of races. And this is what I think very laudably most geneticists or archaeogeneticists actually do, for instance, in the Jena Declaration. Correspondingly, scholars have devised numerous approaches and theories to deal with this multiplicity. So here you see all these possible terms, and there are many more by which you can approach and react to human diversities. All of these overlapping approaches have yielded valuable results, but also created a leopard skin of separate fields which are not easy to navigate. So perhaps a broader perspective could help. Of course, I guess human diversity can be regarded as being actually out there. I mean, people are diverse, upon which all sorts of distinctions can be inscribed. It can, as Mirko Cannavaro has reminded us, be used as a label for a comfortable multiculturalism, but as I would suggest, also as a foil for analyzing strategies of identifications and distinctions and their impact on society. I looked it up a bit, and remarkably, diversity research so far mainly seems to have been a concern in management studies, where the issue was whether diverse teams were more creative and efficient than homogeneous ones. On the other hand, of course, in public debates, the label diversity has somehow been reduced to sexual diversity. I think that exploring human diversity in general on its own terms and the different reactions to it is an interesting option. That is at least the loose framework that we have chosen for the new cluster of excellence in Austria, Eurasian transformations. So this is an advertisement bit. We will see how far that can take us. In any case, I would argue that the concepts of identity and alterity are still suitable as overarching categories to describe the various strategies to deal with diversity. As a scholarly category, identity only makes sense as a dynamic and not a static term. And it should not obscure the multiplicities that strategies of identification actually seek to streamline. Admittedly, the concept of identity has been used and also misused for manifold scholarly and political agendas, like ethnicity. But any adequate scholarly concept in this contested field would be prone to such misuse. Ironically, and that has also been mentioned before, the terms identity and ethnicity had originally been introduced to avoid the ideological overtones in terms such as race, tribe, nation, or folk. And now race is back as an alternative paradigm to cover almost the entire range of the terms that denote reactions to diversity. Can it offer a broader perspective? Okay. Research on race in pre-modern periods has a double genealogy in recent scholarship. Yes. One is the genealogy of anti-Semitism, which owes much of its urgency to the Holocaust and other anti-Semitic movements. This subject requires some differentiation because Jews were variously persecuted as a religion, a class, an ethnic group, or a race. The other strand emerged to counter ongoing racism in the US after the legal emancipation of Black people. Critical race theory was designed to unveil the many hidden forms of racism that constituted practical barriers in Black lives, from diminished career opportunities to police violence. When used as a historical approach, the intention became to denounce a dominant white discourse that enabled and legitimized despising, enslaving, and discriminating against people of color. In recent years, it has led to the emergence of a new paradigm in historical studies, which seems to be based on three presuppositions. First, that race thinking was crucial for the way in which white supremacy was imposed, in fact, since the classical period. Second, that Europe owes its ascendance in the modern period, not least to a ruthless suppression of all others, not only in the colonies, but also in Europe itself. And third, that modern humanities scholarship has also formed on the basis of supremacist and colonialist assumption, which is still reflected in its stubborn claim to be the only way to make valid statements about history. The last point surely needs further discussion, and we should take alternative epistemologies into account. But I think we shouldn't dismiss the one we have. What makes the European scholarly tradition valuable is its critical potential, including the critique of its own position and development. And of course, also critique of the sources, unbiased selection of the evidence, transparency of the heuristic process, open discussion of alternative interpretations, search for consensus, and all that, as far as we are capable of actually living these grand claims. If we abandon this critical methodology, we would open the way for a denial of the Holocaust or for Trump-style and racist alternative truths. Therefore, the three suppositions should be addressed separately. What concerns us here is the first one, the role of race and racial thinking in antiquity and the Middle Ages. First of all, this requires a brief terminological reflection. Now, I apologize to all English native speakers in this room, but English is one of the worst equipped languages in the world to discuss definitions of race, ethnicity, or the nation, and not least in ancient and medieval studies. Latin words gens, natio, genus, or even populus can all be translated by nation, race, tribe, or people without any obvious distinction between them. The result is that many scholars tend to treat race and ethnicity as an equivalent. This equation, however, makes race seem so normal. It's the same like gens, ethnicity. And on the other hand, of course, it risks essentializing ethnicity because it also gets all that load of biological definitions that are connected with race. So if you translate Latin gens with race or with natio, with nation, you're going to miss the point. And I've discussed that with many of my English-speaking colleagues, and they were kind of, how does the German dare talk about our beautiful imperial language? Anyway, so a lot of trouble in that discussions, I think, is simply due to that very basic misunderstanding behind the terms. So I would insist on the distinction between race and ethnicity, which allows, among others, accounting for the racialization of ethnic groups. For instance, in the development of racializing tendencies in anti-Judaism to racial anti-Semitism. If it's all the same, you cannot trace any development there. So if we define the Jews as race altogether, we lose it. Therefore, it is more helpful to distinguish between the two concepts, which could be done in the following ways. Sorry, I've made a mess of the order of my slides, obviously. So first, race is inseparable from racism and makes no sense as an objective category. It invariably includes value judgments and notions of superiority, inferiority. It is established by outside description, assignment, while self-identification assertion may only follow insistent ascription. So if you define people as Black all along, they can be Black and proud in the end. Ethnicity often reflects self-identification, which is the core of the concept, although ascription is an integral part of identification processes. It can, but need not be subject to deprecation, prejudice, etc. But value judgments are not constitutive of outside perceptions of ethnic identities. Second, ascription of race is typically based on perceived physical traits and outside markers, whereas ethnic distinctions may, but do not have to rely on physical difference. Third, race is deemed immutable, while even essentialists acknowledge, mostly acknowledge that ethnic identity may change by assimilation and all sorts of other processes. And fourth, racial divides are often binary, Black, white, Christians, Jews, and concern overarching units, whereas ethnicity is a relational system of plural distinctions between a multiplicity of others. So it's a difficult distinctions because ethnicity has a lot of the traits that race also has. Whereas race is defined by them, ethnicity is not necessarily defined by them. So Andreas Wimmer has suggested to regard race as a subtype of ethnicity, which has a lot to recommend it, although it's not kind of a subcategory in a sense. So Geraldine Hank's definition, you've already seen that today, defines race more by its political uses as, yes, that one was wrong. Race is one of the primary names. We have a name retained for the strategic, epistemological, and political commitments it recognizes. That is attached to a repeating tendency of the greatest import to demarcate human beings through differences among humans that are selectively essentialized as absolute and fundamental in order to distribute positions and powers differentially to human groups. So, what can we gain by focusing on the category of race and on race thinking, racialization, etc.? So as Heng shows in her book, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, an analysis of the various forms of racial thinking and racialization may provide a common perspective for ancient, medieval European attitudes towards barbarians, slaves, Jews, Saracens, Ethiopians, Moors, Huns, Mongols, Roma, and for colonial encounters. There is an elephant in the room here as well. We should include Slavs in that list. In the 9th to 11th centuries, Eastern Europe was haunted by traders, and we also heard that before, who exchanged dirhams for slaves and sold Slavs off to Muslim countries. There's a lot of mileage, I think, until today in looking at that. And the Czech-Canadian sociologist Ivan Kalmar has called this in a recent book about the somehow subaltern role of Slavic nations in contemporary European Union. White, but not quite. Looking for race thinking can help to follow common threads of intolerance in the medieval history of Europe. And I would add, not only in Europe, there is the Chinese racism, for instance. It can help to study ways in which Europeans constructed their own superiority versus other parts of the world, which eventually came to serve colonialist and post-colonial expansion and domination. Such an approach could not, however, obscure the differences between rather divergent forms of othering. If we subsume all forms of distinction and all claims of group superiority under racism, we dilute the concept to an everyday practices. Everybody does that, everybody has that. if most white people were labeled as racists and white supremacists anyway, that would make it difficult to denounce hardcore racism. So we should be careful not to reduce all forms of group allegiance in relations to other social groups to simple binaries. So here I finally come to my topic, which is Romans and barbarians. Now, Roman-barbarian relations are an interesting test case for the degree to which various forms of othering can better be understood as racialization, where that takes us. Classical attitudes toward barbarians were full of negative stereotypes, but also ambivalent. On the one hand, the Greeks, and even more so the Romans, sought to acquire information about the barbarians and to become familiar with their names. On the other hand, the sense of superiority of Greeks and Romans, as well as the strategies of exclusion, were reflected in a loose array of mostly derogatory stereotypes that they put to a great variety of uses. Barbarians was a rather elastic generic term that could be used to describe unspecified people originating from beyond the Roman frontiers and from its marginal provinces. What they had in common was that they could be rightfully enslaved because they were inferior. The term could thus transport value judgments or polemic statements beyond its economic function, sometimes also be applied to Romans who behaved barbarously. And in some cases, barbarians could, of course, be presented as noble savages, as the Germans in Tacitus's Germania. They are often described by the barbarians are often described by their bodily features and their physiognomy, although some of them are pictured as beautiful. Happens even with Ethiopians. Barbarians are clearly regarded as subordinate and often ascribed to the realm of nature, whereas the Romans live in the realm of civilization. The latter distinction can be understood, of course, as an element of racialization. However, barbarians hardly was a racial category in itself, whereas the Chinese terminology distinguished between northern, western, southern barbarians and some others. They all had different names. Barbarians spanned the entire range of non-Romans, usually excluding the Persians who were more or less accepted on a par. This included Northwestern European Celts, Northern Germans, some Northeastern groups, the Scythians or Huns from the Eastern Steppes, North Africans, Libyans, Black Ethiopians, Arabians, and others. Much in their diverging ways of life is explained by climate theory. Dark skin resulted from excessive exposure to the sun, while Northerners had a particularly fair complexion. So these really bright-skinned people were not us, but them as well. Roman ethnography is often regarded as a rather inflexible traditional model building on classical Greek texts that determine Roman perceptions and attitudes towards barbarians. Their supposed savagery legitimized attacking, subduing, and enslaving them. Roman emperors used real or fabricated triumphs over barbarians to present themselves as successful protectors of the Pax Romana. In that sense, discourse motivated action. However, the literary descriptions of barbarians that have come down to us should not be taken as the discourse about barbarians. An empire had to rely on a much more substantial level of information, had to take account of much more variegated interests in and experiences with barbarians, and be prepared for more diverse forms of interaction with them. In late antiquity, for instance, barbarian leaders rose to the highest commands in the army and created their own style of serving the empire as imperial barbarians. Increasingly, the notional binary, Romans, barbarians, was subverted by a more complex reality. Barbarians moved up the social hierarchy to occupy positions of power. In the course of the 5th century, the despised barbarians grabbed power within all of the former Western Roman Empire. Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, Angles, Saxons, Huns, Longobards, and others established their kingdoms in what had been Roman provinces. Minorities of specialized warriors with more or less distant origins from the thinly populated lands north of the Roman frontiers now dominated the majority population of former Roman provincials. The extent to which these former subjects of the empire maintained their Romanness varied. In Italy, Gaul, and Spain, they kept their late Latin language, and although to a diminishing degree their literacy. In Britain and in the provinces along the Danube, both largely disappeared. The legal status as Romans became inferior to that of the ruling elites. This division was clearly visible in the amount to be paid as a compensation for killing, wounding, or offending someone. It cost 2 times more to kill a Frank than a Roman. This lower legal status may help to explain why Romans gradually disappeared from the West and either chose territorial identification, Spanish, Italian, Provençal, or Aquitanian, or eventually identified with their new rulers. In this way, the Germanic-speaking minority of the Franks was transformed into the Roman-speaking majority of the French. Only a few pockets of Romans survived, for instance, in the city of Rome, the Romansh in the Swiss Alps, or the Vlachs in southeastern Europe, some of whom reclaimed their Romanness in the 19th century to become a Romanian nation. Therefore, we are facing a paradox that historians have rarely regarded as a paradox. Romans, who had always felt superior to the barbarians, largely slid into inferior legal and social status when barbarian groups came into power on former imperial territory. Still, the barbarian discourse cultivated in the classical culture that had become detached from its functional entanglement with barbarian slavery remained in use, with all the stereotypes attached to it. In parallel, Roman political and cultural traditions remained highly valued. Roman culture and literature were transmitted and emulated in many respects. The church was distinctively Roman, and a Roman empire was reinstated by Charlemagne in 800 CE. This is, in fact, a fascinating test case for how fundamental shifts in social hierarchies affect or do not affect ascriptions of superiority and inferiority, discourses of identity and alterity, and perceptions of difference. It was a complex process, and it cannot be described by simply juxtaposing Romans and barbarians or Romans and Germans, as scholars of earlier periods have done. The early Christians, barbarians and pagans, the early Christians created their own distinction between those who belonged and those who did not. The latter were called pagans, a term derived from the rustics who lived far from the city in its rural districts, the pagos. Second term for the pagans betrays a close conceptual link to the barbarians. Non-Christians were the gentes, the peoples. This builds on another binary concept that was fundamental for Roman imperial ideology. The Romans were a populus, a people by constitution. It was not the ethnic or territorial origin that made one a Roman, but citizenship, law, and culture. By contrast, the barbarians belonged to the gentes, peoples by origin, into which one was born and which belonged to the realm of nature. For many late antique Christian writers, the divisions between Roman barbarians and Christians pagans were closely linked and analogous. The late 4th century poet and propagandist Prudentius, for instance, wrote, and I quote, "As different is the Roman from the barbarian, as man is different from the animal, or the speaking person from the mute. Lest they who follow the teachings of God differ from those who follow senseless cults and superstitions." The frequent occurrence of animal metaphors for barbarians surely represents a racializing element. On the other hand, in the mid-5th century, Salvian of Marseille revived the old Roman topos of the moral superiority of the unspoiled barbarians over the decadent Romans. The Christian sinner was much worse than even the savage barbarian who had not yet had the chance of baptism. Neither of the two divisions, Roman barbarian and Christian pagan, was unsurmountable. So here we are in the discussion whether race actually applies here or not. Difficult one. A person born into one of the gentes could become a Roman citizen and could also convert to Christianity. Both transitions required formal acts, acquiring Roman citizenship or being baptized. In theory, therefore, both distinctions were not fully essentialized. However, what that meant for perceptions of the barbarians, pagans, differed. Even when in 212, the Constitutio Antoniniana made all three subjects of the empire Roman citizens, the intentions of the imperial authorities was not to turn all barbarians into Romans in the long run. Conversely, the New Testament encouraged the Christians to teach all nations. This was taken to mean that Christ's second coming could happen only when all Gentes had at least been given the chance to convert. For God was just, and he would not have given the opportunity of salvation only to some of the world's peoples. In the 5th century, this issue was controversially debated, for instance, in the treatise De Vocatione Omnium Gentium, the calling of all nations, as it is usually translated by Prosper Tiro, a chief advisor of Pope Leo the Great. Around the same time, Christian apologists argued that the barbarian Gentes had crossed Rome's frontiers by divine will to attain salvation. Barbarian migrations were therefore not a sign of Rome's weakness, but of the strengths of the Christian creed. Christianity provided an alternative path to the integration of barbarians in late antique society, one advocated much more proactively and insistently by Christian authorities than the path to Romanness was. At least in theories, Christians then could not enslave other Christians or be enslaved by other Christians. And also in theory, at least the transition between pagan and Christian was contingent on the free will of the converted and did not depend on the choices made by the community the person wished to join, unlike manumission of slaves. Also, one was baptized or not, whereas one could be Roman or barbarian by degrees. In the early 5th century, for instance, the historian Orosius draws a clear distinction between Brother Gaius, leader of a large raiding party, whom he calls a barbarian, pagan, and a real Scythian, and Alaric I, king of the Goths, who had come into the empire 30 years earlier, whom he describes as a Christian, closer to him. Eventually, all post-Roman kingdoms were or became Christian, but not Roman. The result was a plurality of kingdoms, usually with ethnic designation. In the medieval Christian West, ethnic self-definition was crucial for the new ruling elites in order to distinguish themselves from each other and from the provincial majority population, which implied privilege. But they had no sense of a shared ethnic, let alone racial identity between them, although they all spoke Germanic languages and were descended from the German Germani, an umbrella term the Romans had used. Interestingly, this term fades from contemporary text exactly at the time when these former Germans became masters of the Western Empire. Now, could we say that Christianity was racialized as a common container? I have no clue how that could actually be argued. Ancient ideas of the Christians and as gens, why that new race? I wouldn't translate that as race either. It's created a lot of misunderstandings here. But they fade out anyway in the early Middle Ages, whereas the multiplicity of Christian gentes became part of the history of salvation. So there was a new way in which to accommodate Christian ethnic identities in the entire Christendom, as I have argued elsewhere. Eventually, the integration of a barbarian minority, the Franks, and a provincial majority, Gallo-Romans, was achieved within a modified ethnic frame. This was not a straightforward process, and Helmut Reimitz will say much more about it, but full of tensions and shifting constellations. It can tell us much more about the complex forces at play when subaltern groups rise to power and essentialist categorizations need to be adapted. Perhaps apart from Catholicism, a shared feature of Franks and Gauls that allowed the integration was whiteness. Isidore's etymology 9 to 110 explains that Gaul was called that way on account of its whiteness, Arcandore. In the 10th century, Richer of Saint-Remy took up this etymology, stating that that area of Europe that is called Gaul on account of its whiteness, since the inhabitants of this land exhibit the distinguishing feature of a rather fair complexion. Would perhaps be going too far to regard this as a sign of incipient white supremacism, but some of its elements were obviously already in place. Well, after all, Richer also mistakes the Byzantine label as white Bulgarians, and we had the white Croats and the white Serbs already, as a reference to the white skin. So he wasn't sort of racializing the difference between the Franks or the French and these Bulgarians, but he was interested in skin color. This is already my last bit. What is particularly instructive are the legal texts transmitted from the period which apply the term barbarus to the inhabitants of the new kingdoms. Issued by rulers of the new kingdoms, perhaps with the help of Roman jurists, they provide occasional examples of an official self-designation as barbarian. So that is the bit I'm now interested in. Liber Constitutionum, issued by the Burgundian king Sigismund in 517, repeatedly uses barbarus as a synonym for Burgundio. Do we have that? Yes. Or populus noster, or our people. However, on the other hand, the Frankish law book, the Lex Salica, distinguishes between Franks and barbarians living under Salic law, who have an analogous legal status to the noble Franks and can also be called Barbarisaici, but not Franks. A more difficult case is found in the Breviarum Alarici or Lex Romana Visigotorum, a Roman law book which was based on an adaptation of the late Roman Codex Theodosianus. It was issued by Alaric II in 506, shortly before the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse was overcome by the Frankish king Clovis. It also contains the ban on mixed marriages between Romans and barbarians established in the Codex Theodosianus. No Roman should presume to have as wife a barbarian woman of any gens, nor should Roman women ally in matrimony with barbarians. So it still views that from the Roman side and not from the barbarian side. The penalty was nothing less than capital punishment. The breviary replaced the provincials in the Theodosian code with the term Romans, so it ethnicizes it. Most likely, this provision, issued by Alaric shortly before the decisive war against the Franks, was now directed only against Franks and the other barbarians and did not include Goths, as Hagit Sivan has argued. Law codes show that self-identification as barbarians was possible around 500, but it was more common to distinguish between one's own gens and others that were still classed as barbarians. From the Roman point of view, the rhetoric of "he's a barbarian, but" already familiar in imperial times is more frequently used after the 5th century. Hymne Modus, the founder of the Burgundian monastery of Saint Maurice d'Agon, was described in the life of the abbots of the monastery as a barbarian by birth, but modest in his benign manners. Nuntius Fortunatus, an Italian poet, making his living in the late 6th century Frankish kingdoms, rather arrogantly styled himself as an Orpheus among barbarians. Yet he adorned many barbarian nobles with his poetic praise. Though you are a Sigamba, which was an ancient term sometimes used for the Franks, progeny of a noble race, yet the Latin tongue flourishes in your eloquence. Roman by upbringing, barbarian by ancestry, she brought a gentle spirit from a fierce people. The greater glory was to conquer nature. Of course, all these individual statements of praise at the same time confirmed the general principle that barbarians were not orthodox, civilized, modest, or eloquent. Their glory only came from conquering their barbarian nature, which was, however, possible. That might win them the admiration of the Romans, but could also appear preposterous to them. King Kilbrick I wrote Latin poems, introduced new letters into the alphabet for writing in Frankish, and even took part in theological debates. But Bishop Gregory of Tours, nevertheless, mocked him for the former and despised him for the latter efforts. Eventually, the elites of these kingdoms could feel legitimized not to regard themselves as barbarians anymore. The Latin authors of their realms created a narrative of the progress of the gentes from barbarian others to an integral parts of a Christian commonwealth. They also hesitated to describe the neighboring Christian peoples as barbarians. The plurality of Christian kingdoms had become a fundamental feature of the political landscape. From the 8th century onwards, the term barbarians was mainly used for the pagans that surrounded the Christian West, the Muslims in Andalus, the Normans, the Avars and Hungarians. Since the 7th century, anti-Roman rhetoric also appears in the text and becomes more frequent in the Carolingian period. Stulti sunt Romani, sapienti sunt Paioari. Stupid are the Romans, wise are the Bavarians, was written in an early 9th century gloss in both Latin and Old High German. Or St. Goar, according to his life written in 839, had to deal with people who hated omnes Romane nationes et lingue homines, all of Roman birth and language. As Liutprand of Cremona put it in the 10th century, recounting his mission to the Byzantine emperor who doubted that the Western Empire was really Roman, we regard Roman as one of the worst insults. This description of the Byzantine code is full of negative details. Anti-Roman, Italian, French prejudices remained, and so did anti-German ones in Italy and France. The latter only partly follow the classical topoi of barbarians. The ancient barbarian stereotypes were now largely used for steppe peoples, Muslims, and other pagan enemies. Sometimes the old anti-barbarian polemic was still employed against Eastern neighbors that had long become Christians. And I finish with an Austrian. In the 12th century, the bishop and scholar Otto Freising, Babenberg prince, debased the Hungarians, relying not least on physical traits, although his brother Adalbert had married the sister of the Hungarian king Bela II. The Hungarians have an ugly face, deep-set eyes, are of small stature, have savage customs and a barbarian language. Only one really has to bemoan the fate, or rather marvel about God's patience, that he would leave such a beautiful country to human monsters, for they could hardly be called human. The common Christian creed cannot stop racializing views of European neighbors. Thank you.
We see how Germanic perspective interacts in conflict with people discussing this. Yeah, I was
but just a kind of general question. Happy if anyone else wants to chime in on as well. But I know that in the next little bit, after we talk about whiteness, we also talk about blackness and more but I'm just wondering, in general, the work that we do, when do we draw the line from people noticing that skin color is varied between human populations, using that as a framework for categorization? Because I think, you know, we've reading Latin sources and we see that they are noticing that people from India look different than people from Egypt and people in Greece. So they're not colorblind, but they're also not necessarily using it as a way to racially classify individuals. And if they are as far in between, there are things that are more important than these across populations. So I'm wondering where that line is, where we can say he's not just pointing out that people are white, he is saying they are white rather than white person is not involved.
Sure. I mean, that's the crucial question. And of course, if we follow some of the definitions we heard this morning, what it would be essential to actually state that this is racialization would be that actually would lead to hierarchy of hierarchization of these populations, not only in sort of notional terms, but also in legal terms of power, in terms of access to wealth, etc. Here, the problem we have is the difficulty to prove that, because I mean, there are always the unsaid assumptions in these texts, and we can only guess that what is behind somebody noticing somebody else's skin color. So a lot of these things have then revolved on very few source passages, which seem to indicate, okay, here is sort of the smoking gun in which people are actually finally and just for a moment disclosing a true inner self and a true intention in using these observations about physical traits and skin color. I don't know, I mean, this is where I'm kind of a bit hesitant about whether the sort of input from critical race theory actually doesn't push things too far, because critical race theory is born from that challenge to detect racism where it is not being confessed anymore, but simply being something that is still socially very efficient, but hardly ever stated. And of course, that then forces you to simply work like a detective and sort of, you know, this man has committed a deed and you want to prove it. But if you know, you actually look at our sources already knowing that these were white supremacists and you want to prove it, that's risky business. I mean, it creates a grand narrative, and it creates new binaries that we should also at least be entitled to doubt. I mean, I'm not saying that this is not a legitimate theory. What I think to try and make that argument is, I think, from a scholarly point of view, necessary and very important. So we need people who are really trying to make that argument. What we don't need is sort of the moral high ground by which anybody who has a different opinion and doubts that argument or argues against it is then by definition a white supremacist too. I mean, that is the distinction that I would make in this level.
Yeah, but I agree. Yeah, and I think there are people who would argue that the notation of skin color in itself is a form of photo racism, or if that is denied, then you are saying that there was no racism or no prejudice of some kind, and that is also problematic. So it's hard to work with this kind of observations outside. Well, we didn't know about it.
I mean, of course, this is also a slippery discussion, but I wonder, I mean, Black Madonnas are pretty frequent and pretty holy in the Middle Ages, Częstochowa and other places. And if by implication, black color would automatically denote lower social status. I mean, there's a complicated theological argument to make about why she's black, which actually has little to do with actual blackness of skin. But I mean, I would think that you could claim on that background that blackness automatically denotes racism.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, I think you know what I'm talking about. I think we really like the issue that you have that sometimes bringing that the very good skills in college is not enough to see rate that way. He's treated as a white person. But only for the like, for example, I mean,
I know.
on the quick side, like I always see that John Paul classes, the one with the symbolic classes with the report with the white face and the black face, and usually the black face is, like here's people say, made to find the best, and sometimes they have kind of some of them do. Like with this, I assume that there is a contrast in job that between a normal or white face and a black face that is that kind of equate to drunkenness. But then I was reading, for example, South Italy, and I started wondering, okay, perhaps I'm wrong, but the implication there is that I, as maybe an assumption, I was already kind of perpetrating kind of a white supremacy, And yeah, I mean, you kind of, if you look at second guessing each other, after a while you get lost, but we have to check about one house, Houston virus, which had something like that. We talked about the million slaves and contrasting dark skin with the white flowers of the soil. No? Is that racism? I mean, sounds like racism to me, like this slave is praised more despite the dark skin. And the result whiteness of everything is falling am I making an assumption here? Am I accepting my own expectations? So yeah, like I think in a way we know that we discussed, but there is a danger about there is a danger about generalizing the argument. It's perfectly fine to discuss it to that, because I think that's fine when you get worried just by discussing it, you're saying something capitally wrong and that reveals you as some kind of pretty like practice or something, so yeah.
Well, I think this framework, we're all assuming that it's scholarly discourse and not, I should hope. So, yeah.
Unless you all had a question first. Yeah. No, I think if you're going to continue, if you're going to piggyback on them, you should go because I have a slightly different tack to take. So it's
no, just again, reference to Carlos and say, the paradigm is the effect that's relevant one. All of them are free. So not part why are going to know in countries, why are the streets and yellow on Indians and the black are indigenous. Well, if you think about them and you do not find an explanation like why they were treated each other. And one of the things that really whoever was considered as black was cheated in the market. And of course, we assume that because of the quality, right? But no, there's a beginning of the past and for African slaves that are not. While European, whites, Arabic, by Arabic, some would say, they would go to, the higher economy, so the price is much higher. So this is the way we use our prejudiced historians to protect the story, and it's also not really such a hierarchy. Because it's about a hierarchy, but
That's right. This intolerant that is not really related to where people are from, but it's very related to and so it's
I'm going to change direction away from cooler a little bit, and I wanted to circle back to your mention of Denise Rules, why this is race, and I'm not going to quibble with the fact that you don't think it should have been translated as race, because I think that sort of untranslatability / infinite translatability is sort of the crux of your argument is really interesting. But I do think that I'm curious what you make of her work, because I do think she was using that title somewhat ironically, in the sense that she's sort of positing that the reason Christians are being racialized in her framework is because they're the gens to transcend all gentes. The point is, when you become Christian, you no longer need to have the particulars because you have been subsumed into a universal that transcends the particulars. But then she sort of says, in creating a universal that is Christendom, the gens to transcend all gentes, you're also, by the same token, saying those people who hold on to having their gens, those people who hold on to those worldly particulars, as opposed to achieving the cosmic transcendence that we have, are then part of a civilizational gradient. You're already creating a new hegemonic discourse. So I thought her point was kind of, even when you purport to have achieved escape velocity from gens, however we choose to translate that, you're falling back into its logics. It's sort of the same concept that we see with the idea of ever becoming post-racial in like American discourse. So I'm curious if you could speak more to sort of how you find that argument working with the line moving as we discussed between barbarians and Christians and all these sorts of things, and whether you've actually found your work germane in that sense.
Well, I mean, the point was that Denise Buell's argument was really very sophisticated, as you you've put it in a nutshell. But of course, some of the debate that ensued then latched on to this. Oh, great! So here we have. At the time, it was not so much about racialization yet, but it was about this was the way in which the Christians defined themselves, as long as they were a minority, persecuted minority, sort of in ethnic terms in the Roman context, which probably there is a point to make, but that disappears in the 4th century when they become kind of dominant, majoritarian. And there is of course, an interesting dialectic about sort of universality and particularity in sort of the styling of the Christian community or communities. What I did quite a bit of research on was then how even quotes that addressed the Christians as a whole, for instance, in that letter of Peter, where he addresses the Christian community as a whole gens and as a, so that are 4 bits, don't remember them all. But that was then taken from this context of addressing the Christians to addressing particular Christian gentes, and used to give them a separate identity within a Christian community, founded on some perception of particularity, being perhaps more Christian and more endowed by divine grace, and there is that interesting precarious balance between trying to construct something like a new chosen people, which they're very hesitant about, and trying to keep that kind of rhetoric, which comes mostly from the letters of the apostles, for the whole Christian community. But in that context that I've mentioned, so go and teach all gentes, it is clear that it is being used to argue that there is something providential in the existence of the gentes, and I've argued that this is an important element in distinguishing the post-Roman European kingdoms from most other post-imperial formations all over Eurasia, because it is so unusual that there should be a plurality of kingdoms with ethnic definitions in any post-imperial setting. Everywhere else, these post-imperial formations after the demise of the Caliphate, for instance, or also after the Han and Tang empires in China, are more or less defined by the dynasties that rule them. And that the ethnic basis, wherever that has existed, Xiongnu or Xianbei in China, or also, of course, Bedouins, Iranian tribes, or whatever, Armenians in the post-Caliphate context evaporate. Whereas these ethnic definitions of the gentes in the Western European context remain on the map, even where these, I mean, even Burgundy still exists, although the Burgundian kingdoms was an episode of 50 years. My argument was that this must have a lot to do with that sort of providential Christian legitimation of these kingdoms. It was an argument that nobody ever believed, I think. I wrote a couple of articles about that and thought, oh, well, isn't that an interesting observation? It hasn't been taken on board by anybody to my knowledge.
No, that's why.
Thank you. Six places.
So, our next speaker is Professor Rachel.
Whoops, sorry.
From the University of Maryland. The Schine is a specialist of Indo-Arab literature. He has a book coming along on the rationalization of black protagonists in Arabic poetry. Already published several studies on race and black people. And how this tradition. Focus on is the type of race and religion and of course assimilation in the US.
Thank you. First of all, for the invitation, thank you for having me. Second of all, I need to figure out briefly how to share my particular presentation. So just one moment, please bear with me. That is. And I should also probably maximize this. Oh, no, that's not what I want to do. I apologize. Okay. Excuse the fact that my title does not match, I apologize. So first of all, before I get into my talk, I wanted to begin by meditating a little bit on the name of this symposium, Race and Ethnicity in the Pre-Modern Mediterranean. And I want to state first that I will be pulling the question of race to the fore in this talk, as have so many of us, or rather racialization, the process of making arbitrary human groupings through stratagems and structures of power into an essentialized unit with purported shared traits, not just of body, but of what we might call cultural and spiritual perfectibility. And second, I'll add, again, riffing on the title of the symposium, that I'm going to cheat a little bit and go beyond the Mediterranean in this discussion. That is because throughout this talk, I'm going to be asking what the study of pre-modern narratives that had or have accrued racialized resonances look like in wholly different social, religious, linguistic, and political contexts than in classical or Christian European ones, and why might that question matter? What, in other words, does it even mean to consider the problem of race in the medieval Islamic world? In asking this question, I often describe my research as trying to integrate Islamic studies approaches with what has been increasingly labeled PCRS, or pre-modern critical race studies, which is one of the sort of two branches that Walter talked about before. And PCRS as the sort of term for this branch of study was originally coined by African-American Shakespeare scholar Margot Hendricks. But it's perhaps not intuitive that PCRS and Islamic studies are two non-communicating scholarly camps. After all, the moniker PCRS doesn't indicate territorial, cultural, or religious scopes, only temporal ones, pre-modern critical race studies. Moreover, those who work on the Islamic Middle Ages have their own thought-provoking, if scattershot, history of carrying what people have increasingly called racial pasts. In fact, this quote, which granted is very small, so I'll read part of it, from Malcolm Lyons on Arabic epics, which were a group of texts that originated around the 12th century through the process of textualizing oral folklore, is one of the key passages that started me on my current intellectual journey with these works. So in his 3-volume, 1995 study of Arabic epics, the term for which is Siyar Sha'abiyya, and I'll talk a bit about what that term means momentarily, as part of a breakdown of what he calls the racial groups therein, Lyons, a British Arabist, writes, quote, "Of the audiences to which the narrators of these cycles could appeal, a number must have been either Black or of mixed race." Lyons claims this because of the several prominent Black heroes that are distributed across the Arabic epic corpus. He adds, though, that these works take what he calls an ultimately, quote, ambivalent stance towards Blackness. Now, what is missing from this passage that we might want or expect to see from studies of pre-modern race today is an element of critical reflexivity. In his labeling, Lyons appears to assume that reified ideas of race were already in place in these roughly 800-year-old texts. Or perhaps he's assuming that the language of race is the best language that we presently have to talk about whatever category concepts did exist at the time. Either way, he doesn't spell out quite what he means when he has selected the terminology of racial groups in order to describe what he's seeing in these works. Moreover, in pointing to the representation's ambivalence, Lyons is leaving aside the question of what precisely these racially Black presences in Arabic epics might have meant, either to audience members who would have identified with them, which he posits existed, or to their majority non-Black Arab listenerships and readerships. This is perhaps because despite their geocultural intimacy and histories of intercontinental empire and millennium-long transcontinental slave trades across the Sahara and into the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean, pre-modern Afro-Arab intersections are still frequently missed or misunderstood in scholarship. And this map looks a lot like the one that you've all had on earlier. The racialization that occurred between these interactions is even more misunderstood in many ways. This is also because our own epistemologies of Blackness map only imperfectly onto both the audiences and fashioners of these epics across history. So, for example, many reciters of the epic of the tribe of Hilal in Upper Egypt today, so southern Egypt, today come from a community known as the Heleb, who are one of a group of, or network rather, of groups in the Middle East akin to the Roma or travelers, some of whom trace their roots to South Asia and were perceived as Black in various parts of the Islamic world, as Christina Richardson has recently shown. Medieval and early modern transmitters of the epic of the Yemeni king Saif in Chad lived under an African dynasty that called itself the Saifawa and traced its roots to this South Arabian ruler. These phenomena point to some of the intricacies of racial construction in between Africa and Asia through storytelling, transregionally and transtemporally. And analyzing these kinds of connections is what I spend much of my forthcoming book doing. I'm only able to do that work, though, because the fields of Arabic and Islamic studies have had scholars working in some form or fashion on questions of what we might call race for decades, albeit that they have struggled to communicate these findings to other medievalists focused on the opposite shores of the Mediterranean, as well as to their colleagues in late antique and classical studies. I'll now give a short overview of how some of those disciplinary terrains are staked out and entrenched. And to give you a sense before I do that of this talk's progression, I'm going to move from that discussion of the state of the field or fields to one of how we can use theories of racialization to understand social differentiation in the early Islamic context. I will then supply some examples of how these interpretations can be applied when reading Arabic popular tales, folklore produced by and for the masses, which is to say that I'm going to read these to the end of doing social history. So I'm going to start with the brass tacks and end with story time, basically. Different subfields, of course, are going to position themselves differently vis-a-vis the history of the field in which they originate. Clues to where PCRS, pre-modern critical race studies, might be situated in its home field of medieval and early modern studies is embedded in its name. I'll just minimize that so I can see the quotes. Pre-modern tells us one thing, namely that PCRS disrupts a commonplace historiography that many of us have talked about already today. Race has long been held to be an invention of the modern Western state and its sciences, subjectivities, and colonial commitments, all of which serve to render, in the words of Denise Ferreira da Silva, quote, post-Enlightenment European bodies and social configurations as the sole signifiers of actualized universal reason. In other words, the making of race resulted in only white European bodies backed by a specific and eminently modern intellectual legacy, housing pure and unmarked subjects, and being able thus to signify and exercise objectivity, while the rest of the world could not. One salient critique of this narrative comes to us from Geraldine Heng, who's been mentioned several times today, who shows us that to view modernity as an eruption or a radical break with the past prevents us, from historicizing things like modern Western whiteness, and thus, in her words, absolves medieval time, going back to that moral terrain that Walter was talking about. Where Heng critiques the periodization of racist history, I'm going to add a critique of its spatialization. And then the C in PCRS critical tells us something else, namely that pre-modern critical race studies divorces itself sharply from classificatory projects like Lyon's list of races in order to underscore that race is a shifting social construct and not an inert biological fact. Margot Hendricks, who again coined the term, appears to include non-Western subjectivities in this critical approach, saying that PCRS must, quote, interrogate the erasure of indigenous peoples' historical and present sovereignty in places like Africa and the Middle East. But again, here we might quibble with the slipperiness of using the term indigenous as a proxy for not being white colonizers, particularly with respect to the medieval Muslim world that spanned Afro-Eurasia. These places all have their own histories of migration, conquest, encounter, inclusion, and exclusion. If we are to make a full interrogation into other people's ways of seeing, we must therefore contemplate how others may have had their own techniques of racialization and their own senses of unconditioned subjectivity vis-a-vis those that they raced. So in other words, the critical study of race and pre-modernity should entail multiple centers and peripheries, but again, the PCRS camp has not really entertained the idea of bridging itself with the Islamic context in order to achieve that sort of contextualization. So we might ask then, what would it look like to discuss racialization in pre-modern Islamic contexts? Throughout the early medieval period, Sultan Sombathi detects the emergence in the Islamic world of what he calls a universal genealogical chart that itemized the known world's peoples through a combination of elements, some of which we've discussed before and some of which we have not. There were pre-existing Arabian customs, first of all, of taxonomizing tribal lineages, or ansab, singular is nasab, which became generalized to all of humanity through the use of Noahic lineages that entered Islamic scholarly works through things called Isra'iliyat, or narratives of the Jews and Christians who were collocated with Muslim communities. These lineages were lent further biobehavioral meaning through the addition of Greco-Roman climatological sciences and humoral medicine into the Islamic corpus. All of this became foundational then to mapping traditions that cohered in the Islamic world in the 10th century. So in this layered tripartite model, Noah's descendants settled the globe's different climate zones, usually divided by latitude, as you can see on Hamdani's 10th century schematic map right there. And each zone differently was said to affect the body's constitution and therefore differently produced external looks as well as internal qualities like the intellect. As generations progressed, with Sam's descendants or Shem's descendants inhabiting the world's temperate Mediterranean zones, Yafet or Japheths in the world's north, and Hems in the world's south, differences of local nature produced by the climate solidified the brothers' descendants as different human types. Ham also, of course, has a specific and unique, widely circulated backstory in which he was supposedly cursed by his father with blackness and enslavement. This story does not occur in the Quran and also does not occur to this extent in its elaboration in Genesis and the Hebrew Bible, but it does again occur in Israeliyat and in the Qisas al-Anbiya, or stories of the prophets tradition in Islam. And in the case of Ham's progeny, a particular racial geographic formation concomitantly develops called the lands of the blacks, or Bilad al-Sudan, which connotes in many cases the entire world south. So again, those sort of latitudes at the edge of human habitability by the equator. And in other cases, comes to just narrow down to focus on the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa. The vocabularies used by medieval Arabic authors to divide humanity in ways that paid reference to, but also transcended these geographic boundaries, features what David Nierenberg has called a, quote, complex of closely associated terms that linked both behavior and appearance to nature and production. Among these, one finds words bearing overlapping connotations of one's root, one's erq, or one's asl, one's stock, primarily things like jins, which is cognate with gens and genos, or one's ronsur, and also the idea of one's lineal heritage that I mentioned before, one's nesab. All of these articulate individuals' biocultural inheritance in essentialized and metaphorical terms that suggest their traceability to a primordial place or people of origin. They construe one's group identity as a product of deeply historical, spatially situated, and natural processes. Per Adam Hochman, who's a philosopher of race, we can best understand this race naturalist paradigm in which cultural affinity travels biologically and manifests in or on the body by thinking about the process behind the paradigm rather than its products. And so while I do not necessarily translate any of the foregoing terms, erq, asl, jins, ronsur, ansab, etc., as race, I take these all en masse as demonstrative of patterns that we might analyze productively as and through theories of racialization. Having laid this groundwork, we can then work with these concepts comparatively. So in contrast with the connotations of more cognate terms to our modern word race, like raza in the Spanish, which Ana M. Gomez Bravo shows was initially used in the medieval period to mean a defect in an object's purity, as with an alloyed metal or a stained gemstone, to have things like nesab, erq, or ansur in early Arabic literature was to have strength of social standing. Nesab, for example, is typically found paired with hasab, or inherited merit. And one who is said to have these two qualities is usually a person with known lineal bona fides. According to Louis Marlowe, in the early Islamic period, this usage spurs an apologetic counter-narrative in which people start to proclaim things like that their hasab is their deen or their religious fidelity, and that their nasab is their Islam. Effectively, this says that individual righteousness can outweigh lineage, while also reinforcing lineage's rhetorical importance in making that case. Edmund Hayes, who's a Persianist, notes a similar role for the term in Persian nejad, which structures lineage and ethnicity in ways through which race emerges. We might productively place these usages alongside other medieval developments. So for example, the field of biobehavioral terms found in early Arabic literature might be less analogous to the Spanish raza. However, it is more analogous to what Charles de Miramont has noted of the first appearances of the word classe, race, in 15th century French texts. In the French, class became linked with ideas about heritable nobility within dynasties due to understandings of heredity that preceded the term's adoption. According to de Miramont, though, this is on its surface contradictory. Ideas of biologically transferred merit stand, quote, against the ideological core of nobility, which insists on individual virtue. In other words, the term class, as applied to intergenerational yet individual nobility, embedded similar tensions to the pairing of things like hasab, inherited merit, and nasab, lineage. And we can see that in medieval Arabic-speaking domains, the use of racialized descriptors like these was similarly both sustained and militated against in various forms of Muslim discourse. In the early Islamic period, when the geographical and ethnological innovations that linked Noahic, humoral, and Arabian interpretations of heredity were being made, nasab, one's lineage, was also gradually changing meaning in another key respect. It was paternalizing. In the pre-Islamic period, people who had a mix of male Arabian and female non-Arabian parentage were pejoratively dubbed hajins, or mixed, showing that matrilineal matters. You can only be said to be mixed if both of your parents are said to have contributed to your lineage. In the early Islamic era, though, nasab came to just mean one's lineage through one's father, and hajin identities concomitantly start to disappear. Paternal rights, in the words of Manichaea, still were mediated by womb kinships, and the proprietary relationship men had over women's sexuality and reproduction in the form of a legal structure in Islam called milk al-nikah, which basically means the ownership of one's sexuality. In being tied to wombs and semen, the production of one's racialized social category was thus largely not contingent on blood as it became elsewhere. Elizabeth Urban, who's a scholar of the early Islamic period who notes this shift, has described the importance of these changes to ideas of lineage for sustaining caliph's legitimacy, despite the increased use of foreign concubinage, because it let leaders keep claiming what she calls full Arabness, despite having mothers who were non-Arabian. To do this, people drew on sacred history as well, in the form of foreign concubine mothers who were progenitors of contemporary ideas of Arabness, like Hagar, who didn't marry, who was the concubine to Abraham, and also Muhammad's concubine, a Coptic woman named Maria. Institutional life changes in kind as lineage is being produced in these new ways. So a constellation of institutions that let pseudo-agnates attach themselves to Arabian patrilines as they rise in importance arises. These institutions include the idea of being an walad, or mother of a child, which enabled the children of concubines to claim the paternity of their fathers. So in other words, if you were a child who was born to a concubine in the Islamic context, you would be born into your father's nasab, you would have his patriline, but you also would then give your mother a new status. She would become a mother of a child, which meant that she could neither be sold nor gifted from the home, and that when the owner died, she would be manumitted. So your being born into freedom also was a mechanism for bootstrapping her into freedom and assimilation. There was also another institution that sort of companionate to this, but again, sort of pseudo-agnatic and could work for either women or men, called wala, or literally being brought close. And this was a structure that was both manumissive and cliental. So it's kind of similar to the Byzantine component, in which after you are freed, you stay with your owner's household, but you do so in a state of dependency that is a form of unfreedom that is not enslavement. This was similar to wala in the sense that wala meant that you could be somebody's lower mawla, somebody's either client through an ad hoc contract or through being manumitted, and you would benefit from attachment to that family and the privileges that that affords you in society, while also still, of course, being a subordinate figure. These legal constructs reified patrilineal lineage's importance and let people extend the value of that patriline to others, even those who were technically outside of their kinship group. But of course, not everyone who technically had an Arab patrilineal nasab was racialized in the same way. So Urban's caliphs, for example, were able to successfully make that claim on full Arabness and extend it. But in contrast, I find that heroes who are designated as Black in these popular epic traditions I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about have a very different range of possible claims that they can make and different social codes to which they adhere when they want to, say, Arabize themselves. The genre of Arabic popular epic is also unique for how it reveals these disparities to us. These works were composed amongst non-elite actors in middle registers of the language and sprawl across thousands of pages. So we can follow the storylines of characters who are being described as Black across textual worlds rather than in traces and anecdata. So for the remainder of my time, I'm going to therefore sketch the representative rules that structure Blackness in these popular texts and speak to some of their real-world implications. A prime example of the disparate engagement that Blackness receives in the Arabic epic tradition is the origin story of a protagonist in a particular epic called Sirat al-Amira Dhat al-Himma, or the tale of the princess or general Fatima Dhat al-Himma. This was a work that was first attested in the 12th century, and across various manuscripts, this work's extended titles recurrently extol the, quote, noble Black armies that support a fictionalized set of Muslim incursions, into Byzantium. The eponymous Fatima, who's the main character of the tale's son, himself a major hero, is unexpectedly born Black to two Arab parents. I can talk more about the background and provenance of the epic, as well as the Sira genre as a whole during the Q&A. But for now, I want to state the particularities of the birth story of this Black protagonist, Abdul Wahab, and its context. Also, I should say that there's a recent translation and abridgment of the Sira that is produced by Penguin Classics. They've imagined Fatima in a very specific way. I don't think she would have actually worn pink skirts. She's usually said to have ridden into battle in armor. That's besides the point. Anyway, when her son, Abdul Wahab, so it says the tale of the pious warriors, champions of the oneness of God, of Dhat or Dhat al-Himma, and al-Batal, who's sort of her sidekick, the prince Abdul Wahab, that's her child, the tribe of Kilab, that's their overall tribe, and the Sudan of Anjab, the noble Black people. So when Abdul Wahab, the third hero in the story, is born Black-skinned to the shock and dismay of all, Fatima's tribesmen go through a series of legal machinations that lead them ultimately to a visit to Mecca. Aspersions fly about whether Fatima had sex with her black milk sibling and squire, a man named Marzouk, or more obliquely about whether her spouse Al-Harith was in fact not as white as he seems, but rather is Abqa, a term originally taken from animal husbandry, meaning that one has both white and black ancestry that can sort of atavistically resurge in subsequent generations. Ultimately, through a set of paternity cases and courtly audiences that involves no less of a scrappy ensemble in the tale than a team of physiognomists, the sixth Shi'i Imam, Jafar as-Sadiq, the Abbasid Caliph al-Hadi, Harun al-Rashid's elder brother, and a whole bunch of other folks, it is certified legally that the reason that Abd al-Wahhab is black is because he was conceived at the time of his mother's menses, and not through any other underlying cause. In seemingly paradoxical contravention, in other words, of that lineal model that I mentioned before, Abd al-Wahhab's blackness does indeed originate in blood, but not in bloodline. Menstrual sex is forbidden in Islam, so the contact of this kind of blood with the issue that otherwise would create a child conventionally is not supposed to occur, for reasons that I can go into during the Q&A. And so Abd al-Wahhab's origins are multiply taboo. Yet in order to understand the rest of the story that I will lay out, here we might simply remember that despite these origins, Abd al-Wahhab is a hero. These queer beginnings may seem to render him an ironic figure at best and a cautionary tale at worst, and yet we are promised from his birth onward that he is going to do great things within the narrative. Jafar as-Sadiq, the sixth Shi'i Imam who helps to certify this judgment that declares him a legitimate but black child, refers to him as the shield of the prophet's grave, Tors Qabr al-Nabi. And shortly afterward, when the heroes visit the Caliph al-Hadi in Baghdad, al-Hadi gifts Abd al-Wahhab his first small militia in the form of 20 black slaves, some of whom are said to be giants. This gift sets up one of Abd al-Wahhab's primary roles throughout the text. He becomes a paternalistic, purely Arab, but miraculously black mentor, manumitter, and upper mawla, so upper client, or patron rather, to numerous other black people throughout the text, whom he views, as you can see in this quote that I accidentally paged away from, as kindred to himself. Oh no, wait, where is it? Yes, it's right here. So it says, when the prince or emir saw a black person, he became joyous, and if he were a slave, he would go to extremes to purchase him, or if he were free, he became intent upon making him one of his companions. In a subsequent quote where he's riding into battle while he's in the Bilad al-Sudan, while he's in the lands of the blacks against an army of black people, he says that even though he's riding into battle with the enemy, this like terrifying people called the Banu Aqfor, which literally means the people of calamities, he says that he hopes they might become part of his group of comrades, and his face lights up. And then his sidekick, who is non-black, says to him, you'll love them, you'll love these black people, even after God has sent us all of the blacks on this earth, while I ask God Almighty to keep us from their evil. So you can see, in other words, that he's identifying, even though he has this certified Arab lineage, with these black characters throughout the text. And then he's also saying, I want to pull them into my comradeship. I want to pull them into my clientage. I want to pull them into Islam. I want to do all of these things in order to create a coherent black community and ground myself. So this is because Abd al-Wahhab's lineal bona fides, Abd al-Wahhab's lineal bona fides are proven in court, throughout the ensuing narrative, he's going to fall over and over again into what sociologist Neda Magule calls a racial loophole, in which the way that one is ethnically or racially classified in legal contexts, for example, in a paternity case or on a census form, differs from one's experience of being racialized in the everyday through sort of ambient social perception. Abd al-Wahhab is frequently dubbed the Black of the Banu Kilab, the black person of his tribe, and he continuously battles villains who call him a bastard. He keeps black company and is said, as we've seen before, to love all black people. Although non-hereditarily black figures in the seeras like Abd al-Wahhab present us with an exaggerated case, in other words, we can see that through the elision of the possibility of mixed or Hajin identities under the paternalization of lineage, and through the queerness of race, figures like Abd al-Wahhab are able to use their loophole to do really interesting rejiggerings of their community and to re-understand their own identity and interpolate themselves anew into their societies. So a key example that I examine of what this looks like in terms of its consequences in my forthcoming book is when Abd al-Wahhab battles, captures, and converts a giant black warrior under the Byzantines whose name is Abu al-Hizahiz, or Father of Convulsions. In an act of symbolic manumission, after capturing him on the battlefield, Abd al-Wahhab unshackles the captive's arms, and Abu al-Hizahiz converts to Islam later that night after witnessing a towering angel appear over Abd al-Wahhab's head during prayer.
Along with his new cosmic devotions, Abul Hizayhis soon gets an education in Islamic earthly hierarchies when he accompanies his new patron to meet the caliph, who is now Harun al-Rashid and no longer al-Hadi, in Baghdad. After initially being angry to see his patron deferentially bending the knee to a white caliph, Abul Hizayhis follows suit because he is chastised in parental fashion. Abdul Wahab refers to him as his son, Ya Waladi, and instructs him to kneel before the universal ruler of the Muslims. So I will once again read this vignette out to you a little bit. So it says that Abdul Wahab arrived at the main square, and there the caliph of the age met him, flanked by his jurists, scholars, and servants. When Abdul Wahab's gaze fell on al-Rashid, he dismounted, and all those who were around him also dismounted, except for his new ward, Abul Hizayhis. Indeed, Abul Hizayhis did not descend for al-Rashid, and instead exclaimed, "Hey you, with the big turban and the wide ears. Why do you not dismount for Abdul Wahab like he did for you, and do right by him as he has done for you? For if you're the caliph of the whites, he, Abdul Wahab, is the caliph of the blacks." Then Abdul Wahab calls to him and says, "Oh, Abul Hizayhis, oh, my son, everyone who's chastising you, including one of my generals, is in the right and you're in the wrong." And so Abul Hizayhis descends, having been shamed, it says, by Abdul Wahab. So this vignette shows us three things. One is that Abul Hizayhis' time serving in both Byzantine and Muslim armies has taught him that the world is strictly segregated into black and white, so a caliph cannot possibly be serving everyone. Two is that the way to disrupt that understanding and make Abul Hizayhis submit to Muslim power structures is through a form of unfreedom, namely wala, that post-manumissive clientage structure, that makes Abul Hizayhis a childlike dependent on a Muslim of higher and more historic pedigree. This is represented in the text as being didactic rather than a disadvantaging relationship. And then the third thing this shows us is that this bond even of wala is also being racialized. Abul Hizayhis is not only himself regarded as black, but also as formerly enslaved, but he's also brought into the fold by an intermediary authority who has a foot in both of these worlds, with the implication that maximizing on naturalized racial affinities, Abdul Wahab is black too, can work in the service of Islam's expansion. Abdul Wahab is also Arab and can teach people how to become Arabized Muslims. So where Abdul Wahab's birth shows how the process of racialization unfolds, this shows how a racialized group, once it is made, can be used. These two black subjects in the Sirah in radically different social positions demonstrate an idealized path toward inclusion in Islam. This path is grounded in the tutelage structures between old and new Muslims, through which much of the medieval Muslim world was contoured, and which admitted a certain amount of ethno-racial enclavism in order to work. The process for Abul Hizayhis of entering Islam looks noticeably different, and here I come to my question for Walter, from, say, Denise Kimber-Buell's claim of the simultaneous universalism and ethnicization of early medieval Christianity. As she writes, all believers can undergo a process of collective genealogical reassignment as children of God and of metaphorical whitening through salvation, which is a trope that is also physicalized in a variety of narratives. But in Sirat al-Himma here, we see that figures like Abul Hizayhis are not reshaped in the Ummah or Muslim community's racial likeness, but rather the reverse. At the same time, this narrative is proof against the theory that because the Ummah did incorporate all kinds, historically Muslims did not and would not have had cause to think about what we might call race. Rather, we see that in order to sustain a very different articulation of universalism, the Sirahs are activating what we might consider racial logics. We also get to see instances in these epic tales where this version of universalism meets its limits and where assimilation is unsuccessful. This becomes the case with one of Abdul Wahab's wives, the Abyssinian princess Maimuna, whom Abdul Wahab meets on a journey in the lands of Al-Habasha, or roughly the area that is now Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and parts of northern Somalia. Abdul Wahab is one of several Black Sirah heroes to have what we might call a, quote, African expedition as part of his story. And one of his primary roles in these spaces is recruiting people who look like him and may ideally be inclined to him to Islam, and by extension to fight with him on the Byzantine frontier. Maimuna, his future spouse, joins him in this endeavor, but she also sits in a strange place vis-a-vis Islamization. She seems, prior even to Abdul Wahab's arrival, to already have made up her mind on that account. When we're first introduced to Maimuna, we are told, quote, she had a famed intellect and a vaunted beauty, and those who saw her would recall that there had been none like her amongst the Black people, nor her better, for she was resplendently dark, with large black eyes, pert breasts, a thick rear, kohl-rimmed lids, and this was all in contrast to other Black people. وَهَذَا بِخِلَافِ السُّودَان. A man from Yemen, from the land of Zabid and Aden, came to her, one of intellection and virtual and moral discipline. From him, she learned calligraphy and the histories of the Arabs and Persians, and had studied the Arabic language. She was of honorable roots and lineage. So we're seeing the idea that she has honorable lineage, even though she's from a totally different part of the world. So though we're told here that her physical beauty is what sets her apart from those of her ilk, Maimuna takes a different tack, noting that the primary problem with her fellow Blacks, quote unquote, is that they are irrational, which is related to their being irreligious. Before meeting the Muslim heroes of the story, she relates that, quote, she had already resolved to travel with 100,000 of my people, conquering lands and establishing the laws of God Almighty therein. Everyone will know the truth of my words, though my people, Qawmi, have no rationality with which to conduct themselves and worship the one who created them and gave them succor. I shall undertake to incline them towards this. My teacher, i.e. the Yemeni dude, commanded me to do so and acquainted me with the paths of religion, tara'iq ad-din, and guided me toward the service of the Lord of the worlds, Rabb al-Alameen. So evoking the first line of the Quran. The pious and adventuresome Maimuna, who seems already to have become Muslim, in other words, quickly falls for Abd al-Wahhab when he is imprisoned by her father for ransom. We are told that she, quote, longs for Abd al-Wahhab like Zulaykha longed for Yusuf. Zulaykha being the sort of temptress of the Prophet Yusuf in the Quran story, often known as Potiphar's wife in biblical tradition. Here it is worth pausing to note the multiple readings of the Zulaykha and Yusuf allusion. Zulaykha is on the one hand the name given in ensuing traditions, as I said before, to the cunning temptress figure who tries unsuccessfully to seduce Yusuf in the Quran and then to cover this up with lies. But on the other, in Sufi or Muslim mystical interpretations, Zulaykha becomes the embodiment of pure love of God, represented by single-minded and even self-destructive attachment to one of his messengers on earth, the Prophet Yusuf. Yet Abd al-Wahhab does not seem to recognize Maimuna's motivations as being tinged with religious devotion, nor even necessarily to regard her as Muslim when he first meets her. Or if so, he seems to view her as profoundly heterodox in ways aligned with various pernicious stereotypes about Black African Muslims in the world of the text. He at first expresses apprehensions, therefore, that she might lead him into an unchaste relationship, just like the story of the seductress and Joseph. Eventually, though, love wins out, at least for a time. When a now smitten Abd al-Wahhab brings his mother to Maimuna's lushly appointed fortress, we are told that she, quote, looks upon Maimuna and her blackness and surmises that, quote, her marks, simatuha, are not the marks of heroes. Here again, we might dwell on a choice of words. Sima, literally a mark, sometimes used for things like a mole on the face or a scar, fundamentally suggests the physically observable. Fatima, Abd al-Wahhab's mother, easily maps the exterior onto the interior when moving between a surface-level mark and the abstract quality of a hero in ways reminiscent of physiognomic practice, which in Arab Islamic sciences is a mode of knowledge one can acquire about people's dispositions through something called firasa, or perspicacity, by fixing the gaze on minute details of the outer form. The term sima, though, also works affectively, signifying an abstract, extrinsic concept that has become a manifest sign in the physical world because of a person's inner refinements, as with a mark of prostration that you can develop on your forehead because you pray so much, which in turn recalls other people to piety and steadfastness in prayer. In esoteric writings, one can have a sima of such things as truth or kindness. So we have to ask here, is Abd al-Wahhab's mother responding to Maimuna's plain exterior, her physical blackness, or is her exterior a cipher for that which is typically unseen, something about this blackness that is evocative of something else? Yet another resonance to Abd al-Wahhab's mother's statement is latent in the fact that Maimuna does indeed eventually become a villain in the story. At first, she follows Abd al-Wahhab and his mother to the Byzantine frontier with her now enslaved, with her mostly enslaved army from her homeland in tow. She fights valiantly in multiple battles, taking initiative as a commander. She does this explicitly against the grain of her peers. Knowing that most of her Byzantine foes have hardly ever seen Black people, for example, in one instance, she directs her men to uncover their heads in battle for, quote, when the Byzantines see your countenances, they'll think they're the faces of demons, and death will overtake them. Maimuna does likewise, removing her veil from her head and saying, there's no transgression or fadiha and no shame or ad in me doing so if it's done in obeisance to the great and all-forgiving God. So on the one hand, in this instance, Maimuna is here flexing her interpretive muscle, as she does so to victorious effect. On the other, it's striking that in so doing, from a legal ethical perspective, she's exposing her adwa, her zones of modesty, by taking off her veil in battle, in a fashion expected not of free Muslim women, but of the many unfree people who bear Maimuna's Black Abyssinian African likeness. Nonetheless, Maimuna earns many distinctions as a Muslim general, fighting alongside her husband and mother-in-law. But then a succession of traumas ensue. Now pregnant, she's captured by the Byzantines and held on a Mediterranean isle. Her child is separated from her before she breaks free. She's then imprisoned by the Caliph al-Mu'tasim for 7 years, along with Abd al-Wahhab and his confederates, due to a complicated misunderstanding. She assures everyone that if her husband returns to the service of the Caliph after all of this, he will have lost his manhood in her eyes. And he does so anyway. And shortly after being freed, Maimuna then reunites with her long-lost child, who is now a young adult and a formidable warrior himself, piously fighting on the side of the Byzantine Christians. All of these moments conspire to author Maimuna's descent into villainy, which begins tentatively as he tries to balance helping her newfound Christian son with his ambitions to make war against her own co-religionists. Her Muslim peers are quick to judgment, registering her efforts as a betrayal and saying that she cannot still be Muslim, though she avers that in her heart she is. Maimuna's crossover into Christendom is complicated when she meets a Byzantine ruler who offers her the affection that Abd al-Wahhab can no longer muster for her. And yet, even after becoming Christian and turning her weapons on her former community, Maimuna continues to bring Muslims uncanny religious experiences, primarily through dreams. A short while after her conversion, Abd al-Wahhab is visited in a vision by the Prophet Muhammad himself and speaks of his woes concerning his former wife and newfound son, to which Muhammad replies, quote, "May God curse his mother, who has been repelled from the gate of the most merciful and turned toward unbelief after belief and left you forever. Be on your guard with her and turn your heart from her." So Abd al-Wahhab cries out, and then Muhammad says, "Look," and suddenly there appears to Abd al-Wahhab a dome of green emerald upon which run chains of jewels. And then Muhammad says, "Look at what's inside the dome." And Abd al-Wahhab sees that within it, there's a girl, a jariyah, which is a term sometimes used for an enslaved maiden, that were the people of the lower world to see her, they would prize over the sun and moon. She was saying to me, "O son of the worshipful renunciant, who cries over Maimuna, though she has left Islam, I shall be her substitute." It's with these dreams that I'll end my talk. So dreams are a potent tool in Islamic thought. They allow the dreamer to form relationships that are otherwise beyond the reach and claim experience that is otherwise contested. Dwight Reynolds, for example, states that in the widely accepted typology of dreams formulated in Islam's early period, quote, "true dreams are those dispatched by God, reaching a dreamer's inner world from the outside. These dreams come as a bushra, or a form of glad tiding, as above when Muhammad here tells Abd al-Wahhab to take heart in the imminence of the heavenly garden. We are assured that the hero Abd al-Wahhab has unique fitness to receive this vision. At the same time, this dream seems to also show Maimuna's own continuing significance. Abd al-Wahhab would not have needed to receive these signs were it not for her actions in the tale, though we might now question whether Maimuna is the agent of her own destiny or whether she is an instrument in a divine plan for the tale's central Muslim hero, of which even her apostasy is a part. Maimuna brings dreams to others too on the eve of conflict with her. Her son, who is now converted from Byzantine Christianity to Islam, he goes through a lot in the story, has a nearly identical dream to that of his father on the eve of his death. Maimuna then sends him to his destiny, and he is martyred in the midst of crying out in thirst on the battlefield while reciting the Shahada, or the Muslim profession of faith, looking heavenward at a huri, or a heavenly maiden, and holding a drinking glass that his mother cannot see. Even if she left the Muslim community reluctantly and perhaps through causes beyond her control, Maimuna is nonetheless deeply critical of her former comrades and deeply betrayed by her son's eventual conversion. She expresses this in ways that appear a little different from the insults that she has herself endured as a Black Muslim woman. When she encounters her ex-husband, Abd al-Wahhab, on the battlefield, she proclaims that, quote, "The Messiah has freed me from Abd al-Wahhab, he of the distressing face, al-wajh al-kalih, and radiating blackness, as-sawad al-la'ih." Coming from a Black princess, this line is perhaps seemingly incongruous. Has Maimuna internalized the anti-Blackness by which she is surrounded? Has she found her white Byzantine lover infinitely superior to her Black Muslim one? Or does this too have an ironic resonance? The conspicuously pious Abd al-Wahhab, whose adherence to his beliefs left Maimuna struggling to accommodate even their own Christian son, is described here as having a Blackness that radiates or scorches, like hellfire is said to in the Quran. The identical term is used. His face might on the one hand be said to be distressing at a normative physical level, but on the other, this term, kalih, has an affective component. His face afflicts those who see it with emotional pain. Moreover, its description echoes with the afterlife's fires that distort damned people's faces into grimaces. Again, this is a Quranic reference. Maimuna's insults make Abd al-Wahhab almost pitch over in his saddle, perhaps because they strike a chord. In order to maintain his exalted central position as a paragon of the Muslim community, at whose fringes Maimuna has tried and failed to grasp, he has become her hell. So I'm going to close here with a few thoughts on the main conclusions that I've come to by merging aspects of pre-modern critical race studies with these philological and social historical meanderings through the epic genre, which, as I mentioned before, is quite long, and I apologize for telling you lots of stories. So first, I have found that a much higher and more variegated incidence of Black protagonists in this popular performed corpus can't just be a function of what lines framed as appealing to multiple audiences. Rather, I argue that these works respond to a variety of commercial and demographic realities. They teach everyday Muslims how to deal with an everyday politics of race, forming pseudo-agnatic and occupational and religious inroads with others, as well as how to imagine others as part of a much greater endeavor, and how to understand their assimilation as part of a sort of divine plan. They do so by presenting what I call an aspirational history of Islam, in which the Muslim Ummah, or the world community, has always already been adept at grappling with and assimilating difference, and so in the world beyond the text, this can and will continue to be so. We see this in the text's many othered heroes, and in the fact that most virulent racism in the text is leveled almost exclusively at them by villains. We also see it in the illusion of the violence that brings diverse actors into the Muslim world community to begin with, alongside the representation of their avid interest and participation in further expansion. This last point leads me to term situations like Abu Hizeh's conversion, mediated through an educational journey involving angels and caliphs, allegories of assimilation. In allegories of assimilation, cosmic and earthly forces collude to affirm the specific techniques of incorporation that the Arab Muslims are using in the texts. All too mundane pipelines of capture, enslavement, manumission, conversion, clientage, state subordination, and in Maimuna's case, marriage, take on larger-than-life significance through a discourse of divine will and pious duty. It is through these twin universalizing myths, namely that Muslims have always already been prepared as a community to encounter and admit difference, and that price of admission is one gladly given, that we see Black figures' instructive function in the meaning of the Muslim community. I locate Maimuna's instructive function, in contrast, in her failed allegory of assimilation, in which her experience of marrying into an Arab Muslim heritage, having a child, and fighting for a caliph come to naught. And throughout, we can see the cosmic misalignments and inhumanity at hand that show how this can transpire. On the earthly plane, we see her move from a sovereign in her own land to being rejected, abused, tortured, and liminalized in a more normative Muslim sphere. We also see metaphysical interventions that are beyond the scope of Maimuna's free will and that of her peers, and that empower her in new, if ironic ways, as a bringer of dreams, for example. Where earthly forms of unfreedom and divinized forms of subordination are often treated as thinly, at times only etymologically related, here we see them link up in ways that are subtended by characters' Blackness. That is, their Blackness makes the boundaries of community and the limitlessness of the cosmos both become coherent in these works. And that is all. Thank you. Usually there are people in the room who can read the Arabic there. So it says shukran jazilan, which means thank you very much. You got this. You've got this. Yeah. Hi. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Super interesting. I have a question about the photosyntheticality of the main characters in Akademie. So coincidentally read about a year ago in translation. If I remember correctly, he is the result of rape by Dustin's cousin.
Yes.
And although I'm very ignorant of the context, I interpreted this story as a tale of redemption about the son reclaiming the mother's honor, and that being the dominant theme that links everything and reverberates through the next generation. So this figure who sort of has this unconventional starting line and this skin color at intersection, do you find that other stories?
So first of all, yes, and I'll speak to the other stories in which this is something that becomes a trope. But second of all, I want to sort of talk a little bit about what you mentioned in terms of the rape by a cousin producing Abdul Wahab, and then it being ascribed to menses rather than to other types of sexual trespass. So the translation, which was done by Melanie Magado, who's a dear friend, was working very hard to bring this story into modes of social currency that readers in an Anglophone contemporary sphere would appreciate. And one of the things that sort of gets lost maybe a little bit in that is that the text is doing something really interesting and subversive in the narrative of Abdul Wahab's beginnings, in the sense that most schools of fiqh, most schools of Islamic jurisprudence, do not have a concept of what we would today call marital rape. Fatima's cousin by this time is already wed to her, and the reason that this occurs is because she refuses to consummate the marriage, and so he finds other horrifying ways of making that come about. He drugs her, and then he has his way with her, and has his way with her unknowing or not caring that she's also menstruating at the time, which seeds the whole interaction. So one of the things that's really interesting is that the text itself, even though there's not a concept of marital rape that's prosecutable in most jurisprudential contexts, gives you tons of violent imagery to associate with this passage. It literally says that Avhed is her cousin, like waqa alayha, which can mean both to, you know, fuck somebody. It's not a pleasant way of talking about sex, and also literally to attack somebody. So you can see that there's a violence that is sort of underlying that narrative that then does make Abdul Wahhab's story one of redemption, but it does so again within the sphere in which that shouldn't be possible, because that shouldn't be considered a trespass in the first place. So it kind of goes back to this question of when the resultant figure is a Black hero, and when that gets ascribed to Fatima's condition at the time as somebody who's menstruating, and the menstruant body being the taboo one, you have to also wonder whether this is actually a mechanism of moral refraction that actually is more for Al-Harith, more for the father figure who has done his own form of sexual trespass that the text can only gesture at because it doesn't have full language for it. So first of all, I think that's a particularly poignant portion of the story, and it sort of makes your point for you, especially when you add that further context. Second of all, you do see other situations in which in the epic tradition, you have what I might call non-hereditarily Black heroes, heroes who are born sort of mysteriously Black in terms of how society perceives them, to two parents who perceive themselves as white and as Arab. One of them is Sirat Bani Hilal, which I mentioned before as a sira that's recited mostly nowadays in Upper Egypt, but also has a lot of a tradition in Sahelian Central African regions like Chad and parts of Sudan. And there the character is born Black because of, again, kind of a sexual issue, but sort of the inverse of the bad consummation that happens with Fatima and her husband. It's because the mother in the story is struggling with fertility issues. And she really, really needs to birth a son because otherwise her husband's going to divorce her. And she's like, oh no, I need to like figure out a way to do this. So she goes into the woods and she does this ritual with a bunch of other women. And during the ritual, she sees a crow who's attacking all the other birds in the forest. And she says, I want a son just like that. Even if he's as black as that crow, I want a son who's just like that. And lo and behold, she does indeed have a Black son. And what's interesting there is that the child doesn't have violent beginnings per se, but that precipitates a similarly violent result to Abdul Wahhab being sort of put through all these maternity suits, in that she is indeed immediately divorced. The child is considered a bastard and she's evicted from her community. So these are, on the one hand, archetypal underdog heroes. And on the other hand, we see throughout the text that Nasab, the idea that they do indeed have Arabian patrilines, that, you know, the reason that the one kid is non-hereditarily Black is because of a magical accidental ritual, and the other one is because of a medical accident, means that these heroes can not just be redeemed, but be reverted back into Arabness after being attemptedly evicted from it. And it sort of shows how Blackness and Arabness, even though they look like they're at cross purposes, even though they precipitate these kind of intrafamilial violence, are not actually technically at cross purposes. I don't know if that made sense. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and that's directly from the Greek text. Yeah, so the climatological determinism and the idea of dividing the earth into aqalim, which is taken directly, that's a calque from the Greek basically, is directly from Greco-Roman geographies that come into the Islamic context, mostly via Syriac and via the so-called Abbasid translation movement. So that one has a smoking gun of a link. In terms of things like the Ethiopica, that have a concept of image imprinting, in which a wayward gaze, because there's a connection between the eye and the mind that's so strong in Greek sources and also in Muslim ones, can cause you, if you are having sex and conceiving a child at the same time or in the immediate aftermath, to actually have a child that looks like the image that you're fixated on and not the image of your partner, occur throughout various Arab Muslim sources. And there's no reference ever to the Ethiopica itself. What actually usually gets referenced, I'm thinking here of, for example, Ibn Hazm in his Talq al-Hamama, which is a treatise on love by an Andalusi philosopher, actually relates it to a biblical precedent. There's a story in which Jacob has a chat with Laban. I don't remember where in the Bible this is. Somebody who knows the Bible, help me out. Jacob has a chat with Laban, and Laban says, I'll marry you to my wife if you can make a flock of sheep that calves like a bunch of dappled sheep, basically. And Jacob's like, I'm not an expert at animal husbandry, and also I can't just make magical spotted sheep. So how am I going to do this? He takes a bunch of poplar branches and he skins them of the bark so that they're dappled, puts them next to the trough that the sheep drink at. And then the sheep look at the branches, I guess, over time, and then they all calve spotted offspring. So Ibn Hazm says, basically, because he's well read in all of the biblical traditions as well as the Quranic ones, he sort of mentions this story when he's talking about love and sex. He says, this can happen to people too. And then he says, I heard a story once of a woman who was a white Arab woman, had sex with her husband, had a portrait of a black man on the wall, looked at that black portrait, fantasized about it, and had a black kid. And that seems like it must be going through something other than the biblical sheepy tradition in order to get to that particular iteration in the Muslim one. And that very well might be a Greek source, but that source is not cited, and therefore I cannot say whether or not Ibn Hazm knew it. Yes? Thank you. Okay, so I already published on this, so you're a little late. Yeah. Back to Yusuf, yes.
And you go to in order for them to fantasize on this image, so that the children will be like him.
See, and this tells us something really interesting, which is that there's sort of a, yeah, so like, and then you're getting a sort of weird proto-eugenicist twist on this, where it's like, if you calibrate this right, if you put the beautiful guy instead of the portrait of the black man, the gaze is intentional rather than wayward, then you'll get the pretty children as an effectiveness. So there's something fascinating about that. Thank you. Yeah, well, we don't look at him, right? Anyway. Okay, thank you. Well, so I do have an article where I talk about the Ibn Hazm vignette, where I actually talk about the conception story of Abdul Wahhab as well. So I can send you that, but then we should also get the Babylonian Talmud reference in there, and maybe I should write an erratum or an addendum where I talk about that. So thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, one thing how this was used to Arabize. And one thing, the other thing that you said in the introduction, you will not only think about ethnicity. And I want the image of Bilal ibn Rabah.
Ah, yes. Yes.
So this is, he was a civil.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
From human sound, so how much is this based on about the black, the Abyssinian noble black, who is enslaved, etc., as an issue within Islam, that breaks the breaks the law of slavery practically, right? And is used as in a subversive way politically. Taking this into saying that Muna and the other black heroes that are also used as subversive are really portraying other ideology, right? Because they are right using Arabic as the talk about Arabs, right? And comparing this to what else? The passive ideology is the Persians were right? Within the passive they have another role.
Yeah. So basically, how much is this envisioning a new role for the people who are considered Black? Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know whether they are the greatest Black, although they were.
Yeah. So okay, multiple things there. One, is this all just a Abbasid ideology derived from also the textualization under the Abbasids of things like the Sir and Nabi tradition, where you have figures like Bilal? And then two, like, how do the Zenj fit into this? And, are they considered Black, and how are they ethnicized / racialized? Those are the two primary questions, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I would, I would agree with, I think it's definitely within an ideology. I would agree with you more if these texts themselves weren't so maligned, because if the point is that they're sort of reproducing the idealized thought patterns of and assimilation patterns of the state, then why are the siras getting so spurned? What I mean by that is the reason that we know about the siras starting to be put into text in the 12th century, because all of our actual textual evidence of them doesn't begin until the 14th and 15th centuries, is because of them being polemicized by critics. For example, the earliest attestation of these works is not evidence of the works themselves. Rather, it is the autobiography of a guy who converts from Judaism to Islam named Samuel al-Maghribi, who writes a treatise called Ifham al-Yahud, or the besmirching of the Jews. So he converts from Judaism to Islam and then says, I'm going to write a polemic so that everybody knows how to curb stomp the Jews in theological arguments, go me. And one of the things that he gives us as part of his treatise is his own sort of arrival at Muslim traditions and his own fascination with them that led to his conversion. And he says, when I was a really little kid, I read these Dawawin Kibar. I read these giant collections of stories about figures like Dhat al-Himma, al-Batal, her sidekick, al-Iskandar, Alexander the Great, so the Alexander romance. And then I realized that those stories were stupid non-histories. They were fake. They weren't for people who actually want to understand Islamic traditions. And then I started reading the Sira Nabawiyya, the biography of the Prophet traditions, and figures like Tabawi and Miskawayh, who are the universal historians who write about basically everything from Adam to their present day within a sort of learned Muslim paradigm. Siras, in other words, these popular epics, were considered low-class, crass, vulgar, and not to be didactic in the ideal way that the story of Bilal is didactic. So I would agree with you that they are definitely a set of texts that works within Abbasid ideology, but at the same time kind of stands outside of it in interesting ways, because the Abbasid ulama and udavat themselves, the people who were the tastemakers in Abbasid society, who were the elites, didn't think that these were stories worth promoting and didn't think that they promoted the morals that were worth having. So there's something interesting going on there. As for the Zenj question, so does anyone here know who the Zenj are, or do I have to explain that? Okay. Zenj is a term that exists in Arabic and Persian and Turkish. So for example, the word Zanzibar, like the Zanzibari archipelago, is derived from Zanjibar in Persian, which literally means the coast of the Zanj. Zanj was a term that was typically used to describe peoples from what is nowadays known as the Swahili coast, so spanning roughly from Somalia, where the Bilad al-Habasha, that are Maimuna's homelands, basically ends, and modern-day Mozambique. The Zanj were therefore not imported into Islamic lands through the trans-Saharan trade. They weren't brought northward overland primarily. They were rather an Indian Ocean commodity. And they were a commodity that was highly trafficked in the early Abbasid period. They were particularly used in places like Basra, which is on the Tigris south of Baghdad, and has a lot of salt marshes. So they were used for various types of dredging labor, agrarian labor. And in the mid-9th century, there's a giant Zanj revolt that ends up holding the city of Basra for about 15 years and really disrupting the Abbasid sort of claims on absolute legitimacy and all these sorts of things. The Zanj are often grouped in things like universal geographies and things like physiognomic texts as being one of the groups of Sudan. So they are definitely considered Black in the texts. What is interesting is, so you mentioned ethnicity and you were like, you weren't going to talk about ethnicity, and then you talked a lot about Arabness. What is interesting is I kind of am thinking about things like the Sudan versus the Zanj as supra and subcategories. And the supra one, the broader essentialism, sort of like what Walter was saying about the idea of binarized versus multipolar ways of understanding relationality, is the one that I typically am saying is racializing, and the other one's ethnicizing. Maimuna in the story has an interesting relationship to the Zanj. In the sense that even though she refers to herself throughout the text as Habashia, as being Abyssinian, she is said to recognize her son in the story after he was lost for almost 18 years, because she gave him an amulet when he was born that had her name on it in Al-Lugha Az-Zanjiyya, the Zanj language. And then you have to ask a question of, well, is this the text telling you all Black people are the same? People from the Swahili coast and people from modern day Ethiopia are just the same, and we're not going to make a differentiation between them. Of course, the Abyssinians speak the Zanji language. Or is this telling us something about inter-ethnic communication, collaboration, trade that Muslims at the time actually understood to exist? The idea that the Zanj were known as talisman makers and that they traded with the Abyssinians in these types of good. So one of the things that you have to ask, sort of going back to the question of anachronism as you're reading these texts, is when you see categories that look like they're more ethnic versus more racialized being operationalized, is that telling you that people had category confusion or category conflation, or is it telling you that people actually had a really dense knowledge of what was going on in parts of sub-Saharan Africa that you just don't necessarily know to anticipate because you see the racialization happen so much? So I don't know if that answered both of your questions.
Yeah, raise another question, but I mean, it's,
Okay, yeah.
About the gender, gender is very, these women, they are Islam, they're considered as the vector literary integrating Islam. And this is like the second stage. Jewish women, Black.
Yeah, which makes it all the more interesting that even though Maimuna on her surface is a more assimilable character because she can marry Abdul Wahab and Abdul Wahab will still have an Arab kid because he has a certified Arab paternity, she's the one who falls out of the community. And Abul Hazeh, meanwhile, who's coming in as a Black man who's going to struggle to find an Arab woman who wants to partner with him, basically, and doesn't manage to throughout the text, doesn't leave the community. So then you have to ask what's going on there. And part of it is that Abul Hazeh comes into a military structure where he has like a tutor relationship with his mentor Abdul Wahab and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, yay, machismo, men being men together is a good social glue, apparently. But the other thing is that you then have to ask, is something like misogynoir happening here? Is the anti-Blackness that we see leveled at women a particular form of anti-Blackness that we don't see leveled at men in these works? So again, we're back to which theories can we use to understand what's going on here? So, yeah. Sorry, that was a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a coffee break. I would suggest that we get going again at maybe for
30 plus minus. So that nobody needs to stay longer in the building. This presentation. Thank you.
So when are we meeting again?
Viertelstunde.
15 Minuten. Okay. All right.
Great.
Oh, thank you.
If you know this source, second. Where is this?
Talking very long time.